Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out how people live. Today we're going to time travel back to what must have been the party of the century, one with disastrous results for the genial host who threw it. Today is August 17, 1661, and it's hot here, some 35 miles outside of Paris. Nicolas Fouquet is throwing an open house to show off his new chateau and designed to impress the Sun King, Louis XIV, with his own personal exquisite style and taste. Fouquet could afford to hire the best and to build the best. He employed the most famous artisans, artists, designers, musicians, and more to design, build, and decorate his mini palace. Every one of these worthies also worked for Louis, and each took this on as a side job, lured, no doubt, by Fouquet's apparently endless ability to pay them. The king also noticed that these men never quite managed to design anything quite so exquisite, so extraordinary for him, at least so far. That was going to change. When you associate with a man who calls himself the center of the universe and designates himself as the Sun King, a kind of a living god, it doesn't pay to outshine him or ever allow him to be outshone. But I think I hear the sounds of the musicians practicing for what was planned to be the most royal and noble performance of their lives. So let's meet the king and his friends and follow him into the grounds, into the chateau, the king's apartment, to dinner with music, and then stroll the grounds for more entertainment, capped by fireworks and a breakfast at dawn, after which Louis decided to have his host arrested, charged with embezzlement, and generally ruined. Today on The Armchair Traveler. Before we arrive for the fete, we need to become acquainted with the two most important men present, King Louis XIV, shown here along with his mother, Anne of Austria, and his host and superintendent of finance, Nicolas Fouquet. August 17th was hot, and His Majesty was in a sour mood arrived. This wasn't just the result of traveling on dusty 17th century rutted and comfortable carriage. Louis was a man on the edge of either enormous success or failure and oblivion. I think he considered success far more likely and had a plan, since he brought along his mother, his little brother, his mistress, and a gaggle of friends, associates, and members of the court to witness the proceedings. Louis inherited the throne from his father when he was just 5 years old. His mother, Anne of Austria, acted as regent until he was 15, with the assistance of his father's first minister, Cardinal Mazarin. The cardinal had seen the royal family through war. He had put it into 2 separate revolts, reorganized the kingdom's finances, and worked tirelessly to strengthen and enhance the position of the king. Both Louis and his mother were not only loyal but grateful to him. The Louis we are meeting today is neither the young child you see on the left nor the fully fledged monarch he was to become. He was 22 years old, had big ideas, and knew he had enemies. He was not secure on the throne and understood that he could not present himself except as the most powerful man in the realm. He was a king with plans to gain and maintain absolute control and was more than willing to throttle anyone who got in his way. He spent lavishly on all of this and would never permit himself to be upstaged by anyone. Anyone who dealt with him should have understood by this time that it did not pay to outshine the Sun King. But there was one man who really hadn't caught on. Today, Nicolas Fouquet is at the height of his power and prestige. He is the third most powerful man in the kingdom, sitting down table only from the king himself and the king's recently appointed first minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Nicolas clearly believed that this should have been his job. Like Fouquet, Colbert had been one of Cardinal Mazarin's men, but as the cardinal neared death, he chose to recommend Colbert as his replacement. Colbert had good reason to fear Nicolas and had spent months poisoning the king's mind against him. He was a no-show for the party. He had done his work to undermine Nicolas before the invitations had even been issued. Fouquet was not born to the purple. His family was very rich, but they were merchant class. Nicolas augmented that wealth by marrying an heiress, who then conveniently died just a year after their marriage. This meant that all of her fortune went to him. He also had a series of increasingly important jobs in the kingdom, the kind that came with real benefits. His current position as Minister of Finance meant he was responsible for collecting and disbursing taxes and for collecting and disbursing income from the king's estates and holdings. He was paid for this work, although not with a salary. The payment was not ungenerous. He took a cut off the top of everything collected. He was a good money manager. Even so, the king, who spent lavishly on everything, including his wars, was always short of money, and when things got tight, Nicolas, who was, able to lend him vast sums of money. The king was not only in debt, but he was in debt to Fouquet. Worse, Nicholas, from the tales at the time and since, was many things the king was not. Aside from being what we'd call filthy rich, he was quite good looking. Portraits of the king portrayed strength and style, but they couldn't conceal the fact that he had pockmarks and was ugly. They could and did dress him up in the finest, most delicate, most beautiful and fashionable of attire, wigs and pose, but no matter how the painters tried, Louis wasn't particularly good looking. Fouquet, on the other hand, was elegant, sophisticated, and a patron of the arts of all kinds. He knew and could afford to employ the best artists, artisans, scholars, musicians, actors, poets, and even the cook of his time. This was a man who not only knew which fork to pick up, he owned them all. He knew how to behave in public and never overtly put a foot wrong. Fouquet was also something of a snoop. Among other things, he was an expert at nosing out graft and corruption, especially early on in his employment by Mazarin's predecessor, Cardinal Richelieu. This is why the cardinal, himself the beneficiary of a significant amount of graft, and Colbert, who replaced him and had similar sticky fingers, were afraid of him. He also allowed himself to snoop and traffic in petty gossip, including the state of the king's marriage, and his first dalliance with a mistress, Louise de la Vallière, who accompanied the king to this party. The king had been married for a year, his Spanish bride was heavily pregnant, he needed an heir, and he wanted to keep the news away from her for fear of damaging the child. Fouquet apparently tried to bribe Louise for information. Colbert found out about it and informed the king that Fouquet was trying to seduce the new mistress. Despite all of this, Nicholas apparently remained oblivious to how much the king suspected him. He could not or did not understand why he didn't get the job as first minister. Perhaps, I suspect he thought, I haven't sufficiently impressed the king with my accomplishments. I can think of no other explanation for the enormous mistake the otherwise careful Nicholas made this day. He decided to show Louis his new estate and impress him. Unluckily for Nicholas, Louis was impressed, but not at all in the way the host intended. At the time, in Paris, Louis was living in the Louvre, which he hated. He already had plans for a big estate to replace an old hunting lodge in Versailles, but work had barely begun. In the meantime, Fouquet and his teams of architects, builders, decorators, and landscapers had managed to complete the building and the grounds. The chateau finished in just 13 months. He employed thousands of men to do the work, spent lavishly on the building and the fittings. The last several months before this night had seen Fouquet away from Paris, putting the finishing touches on his creation. But I can see the king approaching from the distance. It's time for us to go out and meet him. The first thing the king would have noticed as he approached the estate was the unexpected and unusual symmetry of the design. He saw the decorated wrought iron fencing, complete with decorative carvings, drove through a highly decorated gate, and once past the gate, down a long flat driveway leading to the chateau itself, which rose up in the distance. Brick outbuildings with extensive landscaping beyond flanked the driveway on each side. He likely was greeted by his host, standing in the main entryway at the top of a broad set of steps as he arrived. Later on, after a rest and a lavish dinner, the king and company would have strolled the rest of the grounds and gardens, but the approach by itself was a knockout. Louis clearly must have liked it, for when he had design work done for his palace at Versailles, each of these elements was copied over and incorporated. For now, however, nothing like this existed in the king's portfolio of holdings. The chateau could have been built on the ground as originally lay, but the landscaping, including a great deal of what I think of as terraforming, required 2 decades worth of effort. They basically redesigned the entire plot of land. The chateau was meant to impress, and did even more because of the setting designed to hold it. The king already knew who was responsible for this innovative and eye-catching design. It was none other than the king's own gardener. The innovative genius responsible for the overall design of the estate, as well as the extensive landscaping, was André Le Nôtre. At the time of the party, Le Nôtre held the official title of King's Gardener, as had his father before him. Le Nôtre had been Fouquet's first hire back when he acquired the land, which at the time was as nature had left it, not at all what you see today. There were 3 villages and a rundown chateau, and limited interesting vistas or details on the ground itself. The chateau and its still extensive surrounding park is like a diamond in a specialized setting, designed to show it to its maximum advantage. Le Nôtre might have been the king's gardener, but it was here that he fully developed the idea of French-style gardens, an aesthetic that swept through Europe in the 17th century and was later implemented at Versailles. The king knew this man. This man worked for the king. He had yet to create anything like this for His Majesty. Although the king had visited the chateau several months earlier, when construction work was still underway, the close-up view of the front facade had to have grabbed his attention. Unlike the much simpler buildings he was accustomed to, the style here was quite innovative. From the outside, your eye traveled along several pavilions grouped together around what was almost a curve, housing the steps leading up to the main entrance. The roofline was in multiple levels and included something which the king was familiar with, mansard roofs, those tall pitched roofs invented primarily to allow space underneath to be converted into living space. There were some mansard roofs in the Louvre, but they were expensive to build. Fouquet spared no expense in building this fantasy chateau. In the center, rising above a dome that's not discernible from ground level in front, is a cupola. Once inside the front door, you passed the vestibule and through the grand salon, and you were on the garden side of the estate. You can see the mansard roofs on this side as well as the cupola and the huge dome. It turned out that His Majesty was impressed. He must have thought to himself, "I want this. This is exactly what I want," except of course in French. And it turned out he already knew the architect. His name was Louis Le Vaux. Louis Le Vaux was already well known and was the architect who designed and supervised the physical building of the chateau. Le Vaux is shown here with his father François. Nicolas Fouquet had acquired a run-down chateau along with the rest of the land, including 3 villages, all of which had been transformed. Le Vaux was a French Baroque-style architect who also worked for Louis XIV. He was the architect who helped develop French classical Baroque style, which developed in large part out of his work here on the chateau. He was the first architect to carry out major work on Versailles. Once greeted by our host, Louis and his retinue, or at least part of it, would have walked through that vestibule and into a domed 2-story grand salon. At the time of the party, the room was built and the decorative plaster installed, but the dome remained to be painted. I believe it was here later on that Louis and a select group of his friends would enjoy music and a lavish dinner. Everything the king saw and experienced here told of the taste, style, elegance, and wealth of his host. I suspect it also cemented the king's opinion that Fouquet, to whom the crown owed money, was stealing, and sealed his fate. As I mentioned earlier, the day was hot, the drive was long, and while His Majesty did a pretty good job of concealing his thoughts and feelings, he probably needed to sit down and rest. Fouquet would have escorted him into a lavishly decorated suite of rooms designed for his exclusive use when he traveled. At this time, whenever rich men built castles, chateaux, palaces, or noble homes, if they derived their power and prestige from the crown, and sometimes when they only wanted more power and prestige, they included a room or a suite of rooms in which a traveling king or prince or duke would stay. It would not do to put the Sun King up in a Motel 6. Fouquet and his wife had separate, smaller suites on the next floor up. The king would have noted the decorations and the lavishness. It turned out he knew the decorator. The exquisite interior decoration was designed, supervised, and in some cases actually created by the painter Charles Le Brun. Like Le Vaux and Le Nôtre, the king already knew about him, and along with these two, he would go along to work on the king's own project, the Palace of Versailles. The year before the party, he had already come to the king's attention with a painting called The Queens of Persia Bowing Before Alexander, which you can see in the inset here. Later on, this painting was to be hung in Versailles, where it remains to this day. The painting was among those that earned Le Brun his reputation, gained him a promotion a few years later, and took him to the position of first painter to the king. The day had already been a long one and hot, and much more was to come. The evidence at hand tells us the king was in a bad mood even before he arrived, one which doubtless worsened by the increasingly gorgeous scenes set before him by someone who was, at bottom, one of his hired hands, and orchestrated, and perhaps this was even more galling, by a significant number of men who were also the king's hired hands. The next item on the royally inspired agenda would have been a lavish dinner. My research hasn't turned up a menu card or even a list of wines, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we know about the time. Dinner in 7th century royal France was an event, not just for the royal family and anyone invited, but for all involved, including those tasked with organizing, preparing, and serving it. That latter group would have understood that this particular dinner was a very high-stakes game. At Versailles, and apparently this was the style, the royal family dined late by our standards, perhaps in part to get them past the heat of the day. On August 17th, sunset in Paris wouldn't have come until after 9 o'clock at night. The Versailles model suggested 10 o'clock for dinner time. The meal would have been substantial, with many courses chosen as much to tickle the royal palate as to show the ability of the host to acquire and present the very best. Not more than 10 years earlier, back in 1651, François-Pierre de la Varenne and his influential cookbook, The French Cook, revolutionized French cooking. De la Varenne's idea was the complete opposite of the Italian tradition, which had gone on since the days of the Roman Empire, heavily spiced and flavored foods, often with a great deal of sugar, even in the meat courses. The extra ingredients showed off the wealth of the host. Imported spices and sugar were expensive, but ultimately disguised the fact, perhaps even the smell, of rotted meat. Varenne's idea was a complete turnaround. Vegetables, for example, were considered inedible and unhealthy by the aristocracy. Only poor people consumed them, and they only did so because there was no other choice. De la Varenne broke from the Italian tradition. He emphasized fresh herbs such as parsley, thyme, and tarragon, all of which could be grown locally. Vegetables like cauliflower, asparagus, peas, artichokes, and cucumbers became all the rage. Sweets and sugar were now relegated to the end of the meal. The goal was to preserve the natural flavors of fresh meat, fish, and vegetables. Everything had changed in the royal kitchens in how food was prepared, presented, and tasted, and Fouquet and his cook would doubtless have known and followed along. Acquiring the ingredients, selecting the recipes, and preparing them were important, but mattered little ultimately if the presentation failed. To this day, exemplars of French cuisine, starting with every trained server or sous chef and reaching all the way to the very top of the culinary firmament, place enormous emphasis on presentation. Although in my experience in some establishments, a beautiful presentation is used to mask slightly inferior ingredients or inept cooking techniques. You should always let your tongue inform your judgments. Each course would have been served on specially commissioned dinnerware. As far as my research has been able to discover, none of that, or the flatware, or the glassware survives. It might have looked a little like the Limoges dinnerware here. Dinner was a bit like a play, but one with many acts, each accompanied by music, in this case, produced by strolling violinists. It would have taken a considerable amount of time. Running an establishment like this and putting together a dinner like this was an enormous job. The man in charge of the feast, and likely a great deal more, was the cook, François Vatel. In my experience, a good cook who can manage what amounts to a banquet hall and an estate is probably harder to find than a good minister. This party was a huge responsibility, since the king was something of a gourmet, and only the finest, most difficult to obtain ingredients, gorgeously arranged, would have been presented to him. I can guarantee you that weeks of planning went into every aspect of this meal. The whole proceeding must have been absolutely nerve-wracking. The feast prepared for Louis would doubtless have been gorgeous and substantial, and would have taken quite some time to consume. Louis was still young, but according to his sister-in-law, the king had an insatiable appetite. She is recorded as saying he could eat 4 plates of soup, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a large plate of salad, 2 slices of ham, mutton au jus with garlic, a plate of pastry, all followed by fruit and hard-boiled eggs. This doesn't even consider the wine, possibly a different vintage for each course. Much of the food would have been produced, but for a party like this, Fouquet could and did call on vendors from all over the country. Louis liked oysters, but given the time of year, this was a month without an R, and since the days of the Roman occupation, the local residents avoided consuming those delicious briny bivalves in those months, they likely weren't served. He also liked salads and apparently started a vogue for what we would call salade composée, including some of those newly stylish items like fresh fruits, vegetables, and flowers. Remember my mention of seafood, because we'll hear more about this some years later in connection with the ultimate downfall of the cook. During the dinner, the king and company enjoyed not just their meal, but violin music composed and performed in part by Jean-Baptiste Lully, shown here on the left. Originally Italian, but now a naturalized Frenchman. Lully was a composer, guitarist, violinist, and a dancer, and he is considered a master of the French Baroque style. He was also one of the king's hired men. When Louis XIV had taken over reins of government in 1661, he named Lully as superintendent of royal music and music master for the entire family. After dinner, Nicholas would have led his guests through the garden doors and onto the grounds. As they strolled the grounds, admiring the landscaping, the canals, the fountains, and the statues, they stopped in a glade and enjoyed a play, written by a man famous to us by his pen name Molière, shown here on the right. Fouquet had commissioned the play expressly for the amusement of the king, but there was a problem. Molière was supposed to mount both a play and a ballet, and found that he did not have a big enough cast to meet the demands. Molière therefore decided to combine the ballet and play so that his goal could be met. Tonight's entertainment was an early work called Les Fâcheux, a name which could mean annoying, disagreeable, unfortunate, or impertinent. Lully provided some of the music for the play. The play was about a man in love who tries to meet his beloved in private, but the girl's guardian does not approve. The guardian tries to keep them from meeting during an evening party by getting them into silly conversations with 9 impertinent people. All 9 of the impertinent people were apparently played by Molière himself in this presentation. History tells us that the king loved the play. After the play, the company continued to stroll the grounds and admired the installations. The visitors eventually reached the far end of the estate and turned back toward the chateau, but this was by no means the end of the evening's diversions. These 3 views give you some idea of the scale of Le Nôtre's handiwork. The 18th century engraving you see on the top left shows the grounds from the far end of the property beyond where the statue of Hercules was supposed to stand. On the lower left is a view of the extensive plantings today. The plants forming the scrolls inside the beds are boxwoods. After Fouquet's fall, which we'll discuss next, work on the estate stalled. On the right is a statue of Hercules. A statue of Hercules was planned to go in this location in the master plan, but was never put into place. The one you see here was only added to the grounds in the 19th century, sometime after the new owners, the current family, purchased the estate. So even though the statue wasn't part of Vaux le Vicomte in 1661, it is part of the estate today. Afterward, they all walked back toward the chateau, their way lit up by fireworks. Fouquet gave a number of banquets in the 6 weeks or so before he entered the king, perhaps his dry runs, and was doubtless looking forward to giving a great many more. Unfortunately, that was not to be. Word probably leaked back from Paris about his huge mistake, and Nicolas apparently fled home back to his native Nantes, expecting the king's wrath to cool. The king had certainly been by turns outraged, furious, and jealous. He apparently managed to conceal his anger until afterward. One account says that he wanted to have his guard arrest Fouquet on the spot and drag him off, but that his mother, who had witnessed what was in the king's eyes his humiliation, persuaded him to wait. Revenge, she must have counseled, is a dish best served cold. Fouquet made a fundamental mistake and misjudgment about his superior. The party was supposed to honor the king, but instead glorified and honored one of his hired hand. In everything here, Nicholas managed to outshine the Sun King. It does not do to accomplish that. His worst offenses probably weren't even the alleged graft and corruption, and to this day it's not clear whether he really was stealing from the crown or just taking the usual cut, or the rumor, helpfully spread by Colbert, that he had tried to seduce the king's new mistress. These things were bad, but worse was the fact that the entire affair outshone the king. Louis bided his time for 3 weeks, then he sent his men to seize the chateau, the silverware, the dishes, the orange trees, everything that they could. The famous D'Artagnan and some musketeers sallied forth to Nantes, where Fouquet had apparently tried to hide, and found him, arrested him, and dragged him back to Paris. Fouquet was imprisoned and spent the next 3 years defending himself, but that was to no avail since the verdict had already been decided. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to perpetual exile along with his family. That perhaps wouldn't have been so bad. Doubtless he had funds available outside the kingdom. The custom in the day allowed the king to modify prison sentences. When we think about something like that, we imagine a change for the better. Not this time. Louis sentenced Nicholas to imprisonment, and the man died in jail. All of his property was seized, although his wife, after years of fights in the courts, did manage to get the chateau back. The big three of the construction effort, Le Nôtre, Le Vaux, and Le Brun, survived, thrived, and transferred to work on Versailles, where they set the standard for buildings of these periods. The grounds and building mostly survived as well, although some of the landscaping has recently died. Those plants forming the scrolls inside the beds are actually boxwoods, and unfortunately, many of them are infected with either caterpillars or a fungus. When I visited, there were signs encouraging visitors with euros to spare to contribute to a massive replanting effort. The family estimated then it would cost at least 2 million euros. I believe the donation requested to replace one plant was on the order of 100 euros. I really liked and enjoyed the estate, but not that much, and thought even then that replacing a diseased specimen with another one of the same type was madness. A recent photograph shown here suggests that the family finally agreed. The boxwoods have apparently been pulled and replaced with something metallic, perhaps while they decide what to do next. The musician and playwright, Lully and Molière, were the Rodgers and Hammersteins of their day, and continued to work as a team for quite a while, producing fantasies to entertain the court. And the cook? A good cook and manager is hard to come by. Vatel survived and went on to work for another member of the Bourbon family, the Grand Condé. But he either was initially or surely became a nervous wreck. 10 years later, the Grand Condé, a military hero, decided to throw an extravagant banquet in honor of the king and invited 2,000 people. The entire hosting a dinner for Louis XIV notion must have rattled around and muffled Vatel's brain like a wet, collapsed souffle. According to a letter written by one of the attendees, he was distraught, possibly based on what had happened a decade earlier, and in particular because it was an order of perhaps oysters, the king's favorite food, which would have been perfect for this party, had failed to arrive. Instead of taking a deep sigh, uttering a few choice words, and picking some other food to serve, Vatel was so upset about that and probably other problems that he committed suicide. The story I read said he did it with a sword. I'm a cook, and I personally believe he did it with one of his chef's knives. His body was discovered when someone came to tell him that the fish had arrived. Thank you very much for joining me in Time Travel to the Party of the Century. I hope you enjoyed your visit. Please consider liking, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you'll know when I post new videos. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.